SAT is probably more for you. I will say on the SAT, the content is more dense, right? And you need to be someone who has very good reading comprehension skills, is able to read things in context, figure out what's going on, and that direction of where things are. The ACT is a really straightforward test, although it's time intensive. There are no tricks, there's nothing that is trying to throw you off the right answer. It's just very straightforward, but where the SAT is still not. It is more straightforward than it has been previously, but there's still a fair amount of context and digging through things. That also applies on math questions as well, where the ACT is often testing your knowledge of formulas, the content that you learned in school, and they're pretty straightforward math questions, and they're kind of the questions where you either know the content or you don't know the content, you know how to solve the problem or you don't. The SAT will often conflate various topics, and you'll have to figure out, first off, what are they asking, and how do I solve this problem? And that holds true throughout the SAT. On the ACT, as we talked about, you're allowed to use a calculator. Not given formulas, but you're allowed to use a calculator. So if you're the sort of person who uses the calculator for everything, you're adding 4 plus 7 and you're plugging into the calculator, the ACT is probably more for you than the SAT, where you have that no calculator section. That is one thing we've seen students get thrown off quite a bit with recently is the no calculator. They're just not used to doing that as much. And they get that section and they don't know what to do. They clam up a bit. And then lastly, we talked a lot about the science part, but if you do have a proclivity towards science, you enjoy science, you enjoy reading that content, the ACT might be a little bit more for you than if you really hate science and you don't want to deal with that. That's another way to think about the differences between the two. And then, these are just guidelines for how you think about the two, and partly what it comes down to is what are you most comfortable with? Which test do you have the best feeling with? Which test do you think you will have the best chance to attack and do well at? If you're at 68% and 67% in terms of percentiles on one test versus the other, it might not be clear which one you should take, and it ultimately comes down to a choice of which one do I feel most comfortable with? Does that make sense on SAT versus ACT?
Question. So it sounds like what you're saying is still holds true, and it used to be the case was the case when I was younger. And that's if you're a science math person, really the ACT more often than not is for you. And if you're an English social studies person, the SAT is really more for you. Would you say, generally speaking, that's still the guideline?
Yeah, I think it's probably more nuanced than that because the math section has changed with the lack of calculator, how they've structured those questions, right? And I think there's still, for someone who's can move through a test quickly, has a lot of the content, knows all their formulas, has great memorization skills, the ACT tends to be a good test for them, especially if they lack ability to kind of read through the tricks. There's more tricks in the SAT than there are in the ACT. When we tutor the SAT versus the ACT, we spend a lot more time of this sort of question, the SAT is trying to get you to answer this, and that's the wrong answer. Or this math question, they're trying to throw you off and think that you're solving this, or make you go through this long procedure, when really you just plug it in and it's C, right? And you can see that it starts here and you work your way through it. The SAT does a lot more of that. So some of it comes down to like your ability and how you think through problems, more than just like, are you an English, you're an English person versus a math person at a very high level. And that's especially true because of how much they changed that math section on the SAT. The levels of math are roughly about the same in terms of what you needed to take in school. I will say that one of the things that's different with the ACT is even though they're straightforward questions, sometimes they can be difficult questions, right? Trig is a perfect example. On the SAT, if you basically remember sine, cosine, and tangent and what those are, you're good. Like you're not going to get questions that are harder than that, at least from a knowledge perspective. It might be really hard to figure out that you should use sine on that question, but that's the content as far as the content goes. The ACT will ask some pretty, like here's an isosceles triangle. What's the relationship between this side and that side? Those sorts of questions, straightforward if it's 2 radical 2 versus 1 or whatever it happens to be. The SAT doesn't tend to ask those questions. So that's another thing to consider as well. And like I said, it's really about take those diagnostics. Which one do you feel most comfortable with? Which of these things is more or less true of you? And then figure out which one to go with. So then, once you figured out which test you should take, you should then choose one task. So often parents and students will be like, well, I'm gonna take the SAT and I'm gonna take the ACT. By and large, I think that's not the way to go, right? I think you should say, okay, I'm gonna focus on the SAT, I'm gonna study for the SAT, I'm gonna be ready to go for it, I'm gonna prepare for it, and I'm gonna take that test and do the best that I can on that test, instead of flipping back and forth. A lot of they have become very similar tests, but there's still some nuanced differences in how you prepare for one versus the other, and it's important to focus on that and go full fill on that. The one caveat I will give there is occasionally we'll have students who've done pretty well in the SAT or the ACT, they kind of plateaued on their diagnostic, and it's the summer between their junior and senior year, and like, well, should I take a run at the other test? Then it might make sense, depending on where they are on that diagnostic, to see if they can do better and they have the time, they want to put the time in and the effort into it, but it's still not necessary. But occasionally we do have students who do that. And that's the one time where it makes sense. The flipping back and forth tends to get students more in trouble than anything else. So focusing on one test is really important. And just, no matter what you do, continue to monitor progress, see how you're doing, and no decision is final, especially if you plan ahead. Right, one thing you should be getting from this is planning well ahead of time is really important to be prepared for this. So any further questions on SAT versus ACT? Cool. And then sometimes the fun's not done depending on where you're going to apply to school. You might have to take an SAT 2-subject test. So more selective colleges will ask for these.